The morning mist hung thick over the countryside as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his Royal Guard uniform one final time. After 23 years of faithful service to the crown, he had been chosen for what many considered the most prestigious assignment of his career. He was to oversee the security preparations at Camilla's private estate in preparation for an upcoming royal visit. The weight of this responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders as he drove through the ornate iron gates that marked the entrance to the sprawling property. Thomas had served under 3 different monarchs during his distinguished career. He remembered the nervous energy of his first assignment, standing guard outside Buckingham Palace as a young man barely out of training. Now, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines marking years of dedication around his eyes, he approached this new duty with the calm confidence that only experience could provide. Yet something about this particular assignment felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The estate stretched out before him like something from a fairy tale. Rolling green lawns dotted with ancient oak trees led up to a magnificent Georgian manor house. The building itself seemed to glow in the early morning light, its honey-colored stone walls and countless windows reflecting the sun's rays. Thomas had seen many impressive royal residences during his service, but there was something uniquely enchanting about this place. Perhaps it was the way the gardens seemed to flow naturally into the surrounding countryside, or how the house appeared to have grown from the landscape itself rather than being imposed upon it. As Thomas parked his vehicle near the main entrance, he noticed the unusual quiet that surrounded the estate. Unlike the bustling activity he was accustomed to at other royal properties, this place seemed almost sleepy. A few groundskeepers moved about their morning duties in the distance, their movements unhurried and peaceful. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of birds from the nearby woods. Mrs. Margaret Ashworth, the estate manager, met Thomas at the front door. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an air of quiet efficiency that immediately put him at ease. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple but elegant dress that spoke of practical luxury. As she shook his hand, Thomas noted the genuine warmth in her smile and the way she seemed to truly welcome him rather than simply acknowledge his presence. "Welcome to Rosewood Estate, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had spent years in service to the nobility. "I do hope your journey wasn't too tiresome. We're absolutely delighted to have someone of your experience overseeing our security preparations." As they walked through the entrance hall, Thomas found himself genuinely impressed by the understated elegance of the interior. Unlike some royal residences that could feel overwhelming with their grandeur, this house had a lived-in quality that made it feel like an actual home. The walls were lined with beautiful paintings, not all of them formal portraits, but many depicting peaceful countryside scenes and family moments. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases placed thoughtfully throughout the rooms, their gentle fragrance adding to the welcoming atmosphere. Mrs. Ashworth led him through a series of beautifully appointed rooms, explaining the layout and pointing out areas that would require special attention during the upcoming visit. The morning room, with its large windows overlooking the gardens, would serve as an informal meeting space. The formal dining room, with its gleaming mahogany table and crystal chandelier, would host a small dinner party. Each room had its own character and charm, yet they all flowed together seamlessly. "The house has quite a history," Mrs. Ashworth explained as they paused in the library, a cozy room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. "It's been in royal hands for over 2 centuries, though it's changed quite a bit over the years. Many distinguished guests have walked these halls, and each has left their mark in some way." Thomas found himself genuinely curious about the stories these walls could tell. Unlike his usual assignments, which focused purely on security logistics, this place seemed to invite a more personal connection. He could imagine intimate conversations taking place by the fireplace in the drawing room, or quiet moments of reflection in the sun-drenched conservatory they had just passed through. As the morning progressed, Mrs. Ashworth showed Thomas the various outbuildings and grounds that would need to be secured. The estate was larger than he had initially realized, with formal gardens, a small lake, and even a charming cottage that served as guest quarters. Each area presented its own security considerations, but Thomas found himself approaching the task with unusual enthusiasm. There was something about this place that made him want to protect not just the people who would visit, but the peaceful atmosphere itself. During lunch in the staff dining area, Thomas met several of the estate's employees. There was James, the head gardener, whose hands bore the honest calluses of decades spent coaxing beauty from the earth. His knowledge of every plant and tree on the property was encyclopedic, and his pride in his work was evident in every word he spoke. Sarah, the head housekeeper, had been with the estate for 15 years and spoke of it with the affection one might reserve for a beloved family home. Her attention to detail was remarkable, from the way she arranged flowers to her insistence that every surface gleam with cleanliness. What struck Thomas most about the staff was their genuine contentment with their work. In his experience, royal households could sometimes feel tense or overly formal, with staff members walking on eggshells around their employers. Here, however, there was an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared purpose that he found refreshing. The employees clearly took pride in maintaining the estate, not out of fear or mere duty, but because they truly cared about the place and the people who lived there. After lunch, Mrs. Ashworth suggested they take a more detailed tour of the house's interior, focusing on areas that would require the most careful security attention. As they climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, Thomas admired the portraits that lined the walls. Many depicted members of the royal family from various eras, their formal poses and elaborate clothing speaking to the long history of royal connection to this place. This floor contains the main family bedrooms and several guest suites, Mrs. Ashworth explained as they reached the landing. The master suite overlooks the gardens and has its own private sitting room. We've prepared it according to the specific preferences we were given, though I must say, the requests were quite modest compared to what we sometimes accommodate. Thomas appreciated this insight into the personal preferences of their expected guest. Throughout his career, he had observed that the most genuinely impressive members of the royal family were often those who made the fewest demands and showed the greatest consideration for those who served them. It seemed this assignment might prove to be one of the more pleasant ones he had undertaken. As they moved through the various bedrooms, Mrs. Ashworth pointed out the security features that were already in place, as well as areas where additional measures might be necessary. Each room was beautifully appointed but maintained a sense of comfort over ostentation. The furnishings were clearly valuable, but chosen for their beauty and functionality rather than their ability to impress. In one of the guest bedrooms, Thomas paused to admire a particularly striking painting that depicted the estate's gardens in full bloom. The artist had captured not just the visual beauty of the scene, but somehow conveyed the sense of peace and tranquility that seemed to permeate the entire property. As he studied the brushstrokes, he found himself wondering about the person who had created this work and what had inspired them to capture this particular moment. That was painted by a guest who stayed here several summers ago, Mrs. Ashworth noted, observing his interest. A quite talented amateur artist who said the gardens here provided her with more inspiration than she had felt in years. We were honored when she left it as a gift to the house. This small story seemed to perfectly capture what Thomas was beginning to understand about this estate. It wasn't just a place where royal duties were carried out or formal entertaining took place. It was a genuine retreat, a place where people could reconnect with beauty and find the kind of peace that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself settling into the rhythm of the estate. The urgency and constant vigilance that characterized his usual assignments seemed less necessary here. While he would certainly maintain all proper security protocols, there was something about the place that suggested a more thoughtful, measured approach might be appropriate. When Mrs. Ashworth suggested they conclude the day's tour with a walk through the gardens, Thomas readily agreed. The formal gardens near the house gave way to more naturalistic plantings as they strolled along gravel paths that wound between flower beds and ornamental trees. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and the air was filled with the gentle hum of bees working among the flowers. "The gardens are really James's domain," Mrs. Ashworth said as they paused beside a particularly beautiful rose bed. "He has such an intuitive understanding of what each plant needs and how to create harmony among different species. I sometimes think he communicates with the flowers in a language the rest of us don't quite understand." Thomas could see evidence of this expertise everywhere he looked. The gardens showed the kind of careful attention that came from genuine love rather than mere professional duty. Every plant seemed to be exactly where it belonged, and the overall effect was one of natural beauty enhanced rather than constrained by human intervention. As they made their way back toward the house, Thomas felt a sense of anticipation about the coming weeks that was quite different from his usual pre-assignment feelings. Rather than the mixture of duty and apprehension that typically accompanied new postings, he found himself genuinely looking forward to spending more time in this peaceful environment and working with the clearly dedicated staff who maintained it. The sun was beginning to set as Mrs. Ashworth showed Thomas to his quarters in a comfortable apartment above the estate's administrative offices. The rooms were simply but elegantly furnished, with windows that looked out over the gardens and the countryside beyond. As he unpacked his belongings and settled in for the evening, Thomas reflected on his first day at Rosewood Estate. There was definitely something special about this place, something that went beyond its obvious beauty and historical significance. Perhaps it was the way the staff spoke about their work with genuine pride and affection. Maybe it was the sense of continuity that seemed to flow through every room and corridor, connecting past and present in a seamless tapestry of lived experience. Or it might simply be the rare quality of peace that seemed to settle over everything like a gentle blessing. Whatever it was, Thomas found himself grateful for this assignment in a way that surprised him. After more than 2 decades of faithful service, he had begun to feel somewhat disconnected from the deeper meaning of his work. The constant focus on potential threats and security protocols, while necessary, had gradually worn away some of his enthusiasm for the role. Here, however, he felt reconnected to the idea of protecting something truly valuable, something that brought beauty and peace into the world. As darkness fell and the estate settled into its evening quiet, Thomas stood by his window and looked out over the gardens. In the fading light, he could just make out the silhouettes of the ancient oak trees and the gentle curves of the pathways that wound through the flower beds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight he felt a contentment that had been absent from his life for longer than he cared to admit. He had no way of knowing that his time at Rosewood Estate would prove to be far more eventful than either he or Mrs. Ashworth could possibly have imagined. Hidden within the beautiful rooms and peaceful gardens lay secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his role as a royal guard and lead him into an adventure that would change his life forever. The second morning at Rosewood Estate dawned crisp and clear, with dewdrops sparkling like diamonds across the manicured lawns. Thomas had slept better than he had in months, awakened not by an alarm clock, but by the gentle sounds of birds greeting the sunrise. As he dressed in his uniform and prepared for another day of security preparations, he felt an energy and alertness that surprised him. Perhaps it was simply the effect of the fresh country air, or maybe there was something more profound about the restorative power of this place. Mrs. Ashworth had arranged for him to conduct a more detailed inspection of the house's less public areas today, including the basement storage rooms, the attic spaces, and the various service corridors that would need to be secured during the upcoming visit. These behind-the-scenes areas were always crucial to understand from a security perspective, as they often contained the most vulnerable points of entry or concealment that could pose potential risks. After a hearty breakfast in the staff dining room, Thomas began his exploration in the basement levels beneath the main house. The stone walls and arched ceiling spoke to the building's considerable age, and the temperature was noticeably cooler than in the main living areas. Mrs. Ashworth accompanied him, carrying a large ring of keys and explaining the purpose of each room they encountered. Most of these spaces are used for storage now, she explained as they walked down a corridor lined with heavy wooden doors. Wine cellar, seasonal decorations, furniture that's not currently in use, that sort of thing. We do try to keep everything organized and properly maintained, even if it's not seen by guests on a regular basis. The first several rooms they investigated proved to be exactly as described. Neatly organized storage areas containing the accumulated possessions that any large household tends to gather over time. Thomas noted the sturdy locks and the absence of any obvious security vulnerabilities, making mental notes for his eventual report. However, as they progressed deeper into the basement area, he began to notice something unusual. This corridor seems to extend further than the others, Thomas observed, noting that the hallway appeared to continue beyond where the main structure of the house should reasonably end. Are there additional rooms back there? Mrs. Ashworth paused and consulted her keys, a slight frown crossing her face. You know, I believe there are, but I must confess I haven't had occasion to venture into that section for quite some time. The rooms back there have been sealed up for years, and, honestly, I had nearly forgotten about them. Let me see if I can find the proper key. This piqued Thomas's professional curiosity. In his experience, forgotten or neglected areas were often the ones that posed the greatest security risks. Hidden spaces could be used by those with ill intentions, and rooms that hadn't been inspected regularly might have deteriorated to the point where they could compromise the structural integrity of the building itself. After some searching through her extensive collection, Mrs. Ashworth located what appeared to be the correct key. It was noticeably older and more ornate than the others, made of a heavier metal and decorated with intricate engravings that suggested it dated back many decades. As she fitted it into the lock of a door that Thomas hadn't even noticed in the dim light, he heard the distinctive sound of tumblers turning after what had obviously been a very long time. The door opened with a prolonged creak that echoed through the basement corridors, and a musty smell drifted out from the darkness beyond. Mrs. Ashworth produced a powerful flashlight from somewhere in her practical handbag, and its beam revealed a narrow staircase leading downward into what appeared to be an even older section of the building's foundation. "I had no idea this went down further," Mrs. Ashworth murmured, her voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "In all my years managing this estate, I don't believe I've ever actually been down these particular stairs. How extraordinary that we should discover this today." Thomas felt his security instincts fully engage as they carefully descended the stone steps. The walls here were clearly much older than those in the main basement area, constructed of rougher stone and showing signs of considerable age. The air was cooler and carried a weight that suggested these spaces had been sealed and undisturbed for a very long time indeed. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small chamber from which several passages branched off in different directions. The flashlight beam revealed that these tunnels had been carved directly from the bedrock beneath the estate, and they appeared to be much older than the house itself. Thomas realized they had stumbled upon what were likely medieval foundations, or perhaps even earlier underground structures that had been incorporated into the estate's construction over the centuries. "This is absolutely fascinating," Mrs. Ashworth whispered, her practical demeanor giving way to obvious excitement at the discovery. "I knew the estate had a long history, but I had no idea there were actually preserved medieval elements still intact beneath the current building. We simply must explore this properly." Thomas found himself equally intrigued, though his training kept him focused on the security implications of what they had found. These underground passages could potentially provide unauthorized access to the house, and they would certainly need to be thoroughly investigated and secured before the upcoming royal visit could proceed safely. They chose the passage that seemed to lead in the direction of the main house, and began to follow it carefully, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. The tunnel was well constructed, with arched stone ceilings and walls that showed the skilled craftsmanship of medieval builders. Every few yards, small alcoves had been carved into the walls, and Thomas wondered what purpose they might originally have served. After walking for what seemed like several minutes, they came to another door, this one even more elaborate than the one they had encountered upstairs. It was constructed of thick oak bound with iron, and its surface was covered with intricate carvings that were difficult to make out in the flashlight's beam. What was immediately apparent, however, was the presence of a complex locking mechanism that looked both ancient and extremely sophisticated. Mrs. Ashworth tried several keys from her collection, but none seemed to fit the unusual lock. Thomas examined the mechanism more closely and realized that it wasn't simply a matter of finding the right key. This lock appeared to require a specific sequence of movements, or perhaps multiple keys working in conjunction to open properly. "I don't suppose there are any records about these underground areas in the estate's historical documents," Thomas suggested. "If these passages date back to medieval times, there might be architectural plans or other papers that could give us some clues about what we're dealing with here." Mrs. Ashworth's eyes lit up with the possibility. "Actually, there is an extensive archive of historical documents related to the estate housed in the library upstairs. I've never had occasion to examine them thoroughly, but given what we've discovered today, it might be worth taking a closer look. Some of those papers date back centuries, and they might indeed contain information about these underground chambers." They decided to return to the main house and conduct some research before attempting to proceed any further with their underground exploration. As they made their way back through the passages and up the stairs, Thomas found his mind racing with possibilities and questions. What was behind that elaborate door? Why had these areas been sealed and apparently forgotten? And most importantly, from a security standpoint, did these passages connect to other parts of the estate or possibly even extend beyond its boundaries? Back in the comfortable surroundings of the main house, the contrast between the ancient stone passages and the elegant Georgian interiors was striking. Mrs. Ashworth led Thomas to the library, where she began pulling leather-bound volumes and rolled documents from various shelves and cabinets. Many of the papers were clearly very old, written in flowing script on parchment that had yellowed with age. "Here we are," she said, settling at a large oak table with several promising volumes. These appear to be architectural surveys and building records dating back to the 16th century, and this one seems to be even older. If there are any references to underground structures, we should be able to find them in these documents. Thomas pulled up a chair and began examining the papers Mrs. Ashworth handed him. Many were difficult to read, not only because of their age but also because the style of handwriting and the language used had changed significantly over the centuries. However, as they worked through the documents together, certain patterns began to emerge. References to lower chambers and foundation vaults appeared repeatedly in building records from different time periods. One document, which appeared to be a letter from an architect to a previous owner of the estate, mentioned the securing of the ancient treasury chambers beneath the main foundation and noted that the mechanisms installed by the previous lords remain in excellent working order. "Treasury chambers," Mrs. Ashworth read aloud, her voice filled with wonder. "Thomas, do you suppose we've stumbled upon some sort of historical vault or treasure room? The door we encountered certainly looked elaborate enough to protect something valuable." Thomas had to admit the possibility was intriguing. Throughout British history, wealthy families and royal connections had often maintained private treasuries, particularly during times of political uncertainty when valuable possessions might need to be hidden for safekeeping. The elaborate locking mechanism they had discovered would certainly be consistent with such a purpose. As they continued reading, they found additional references that seemed to support this theory. One document mentioned the safekeeping of Her Majesty's personal effects during the Troubles, while another referred to items of great historical significance preserved for future generations. The dates on these papers suggested that the chambers had been in active use well into the 18th century, though the most recent references they could find dated back nearly 200 years. "I think we may have stumbled upon something truly extraordinary," Mrs. Ashworth said, setting down a particularly old document and looking at Thomas with excitement. "If these chambers really do contain historical treasures that have been sealed away for centuries, this could be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to the royal family in decades." Thomas found himself caught between his security responsibilities and a growing sense of adventure. His training told him that any unknown chambers beneath the estate needed to be thoroughly investigated and secured before the royal visit could proceed. But the historian in him, a side of his personality that had been dormant for years, was absolutely fascinated by the possibility of uncovering genuine historical treasures. "I think we need to approach this systematically," he said, trying to balance excitement with professionalism. "First, we should gather all the information we can from these documents about the layout of the underground chambers and any clues about how the locking mechanisms work. Then, we need to determine the best way to safely open that door and investigate what lies beyond it." Mrs. Ashworth nodded eagerly, clearly as invested in solving this mystery as Thomas was becoming. "I'll contact the estate's historical consultant as well. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell has been researching the property's background for a book she's writing about royal residences. She might have access to additional documents or resources that could help us understand what we've discovered." As the afternoon wore on, they continued their research with growing excitement. Each new document seemed to add another piece to an increasingly fascinating puzzle. They found references to items of great beauty preserved for the crown, treasures held in trust for Her Majesty's pleasure, and artifacts of significant historical importance maintained in perfect condition. One particularly intriguing document appeared to be an inventory list, though much of it was written in what seemed to be some sort of code or cipher. The items listed included mysterious entries like the sapphire collection of particular significance and portraits of the hidden years and manuscripts in the Queen's own hand previously thought lost. "Thomas," Mrs. Ashworth said suddenly, looking up from a document she had been studying intently. "Look at this. It's a letter dated 1823, and it mentions the final sealing of the lower treasury until such time as a trusted guardian of the crown should have need of the contents. Do you think it's possible that we're meant to discover this? That perhaps the timing of your assignment here isn't entirely coincidental?" The thought had occurred to Thomas as well, though he had been hesitant to voice it. In his experience, coincidences in matters related to the royal family were often not coincidences at all. The fact that he had been specifically chosen for this assignment, and that they had discovered the underground chambers on only his second day at the estate, did seem remarkably fortuitous. As evening approached, and they finally set aside their research for the day, Thomas found himself looking forward to the morning with an anticipation he hadn't felt since he was a young man starting his career in royal service. Tomorrow, they would attempt to solve the mystery of the elaborate lock and discover what lay beyond that ancient oak door. Whatever they found, he had a feeling it would prove to be far more significant than either of them could currently imagine. The peaceful atmosphere of Rosewood Estate had taken on an additional layer of mystery and excitement, and Thomas felt more engaged with his work than he had in years. As he settled into his comfortable quarters for the evening, he reflected on how dramatically his perspective on this assignment had changed in just 2 days. What had begun as a routine security preparation had transformed into what might prove to be the adventure of a lifetime. The third day at Rosewood Estate began before sunrise, with Thomas finding himself awake and alert despite having spent much of the previous evening poring over historical documents. His mind had been racing with possibilities about what lay behind the mysterious door in the underground chambers, and sleep had come fitfully. As he dressed and prepared for what promised to be an extraordinary day, he felt a mixture of professional duty and personal excitement that he hadn't experienced since his earliest days in royal service. Mrs. Ashworth had arranged to meet with Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the estate's historical consultant, first thing in the morning. Dr. Hartwell was a distinguished woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. She had spent the better part of 2 decades researching the histories of various royal properties, and her expertise in deciphering historical documents was legendary among those who worked in heritage preservation. I must confess, when Margaret called me last evening about your discovery, I could hardly contain my excitement, Dr. Hartwell said as they gathered in the library with the documents they had uncovered. I've been researching this estate for over a year now, and while I knew there were references to underground chambers in some of the older records, I had assumed they were simply root cellars or wine storage areas that had been sealed up over time. Thomas appreciated her scholarly enthusiasm, but his security training kept him focused on the practical aspects of their situation. Dr. Hartwell, based on your research, do you have any insights into how we might safely open that door we discovered? The locking mechanism appears quite sophisticated, and I'm concerned about potentially damaging either the door itself or whatever might be stored behind it. Dr. Hartwell pulled out a leather portfolio filled with photocopied documents and began spreading them across the table. Actually, I believe I may have found something relevant in the archives at the British Library. There's a collection of papers from the 18th century that includes detailed instructions for what they call the royal treasury mechanisms. If I'm correct, the lock you've described follows a specific pattern that was used to protect the most valuable royal possessions during times of political uncertainty. She showed them a diagram that depicted a complex lock with multiple rotating elements and what appeared to be a sequence of specific movements required to open it. The drawing was remarkably similar to the mechanism they had encountered, though the instructions for operating it were written in a mixture of English and Latin that required careful translation. According to these documents, Dr. Hartwell continued, the lock requires not just a key, but a specific sequence of rotations and pressure points that must be activated in the correct order. It was designed to prevent unauthorized access even if someone managed to obtain the primary key. The instructions here suggest that opening it requires knowledge that would have been passed down through trusted guardians of the crown. Thomas studied the diagram carefully, noting the intricate details of the mechanism. Is there any indication in these documents about what we might find once the door is opened? The inventory lists we discovered yesterday were largely written in code, and we haven't been able to decipher much of the specific contents. Mrs. Ashworth leaned forward with interest. Yes, that's been puzzling me as well. Some of the entries seem to refer to personal effects, while others mentioned items of historical significance. But, without being able to decode the specific references, it's difficult to know what to expect. Dr. Hartwell smiled and pulled out another document from her portfolio. I may be able to help with that as well. The coding system used in these inventories was actually quite common among royal households of the period. It was designed to protect the privacy of the royal family while still maintaining accurate records of valuable possessions. With the key I found in the British Library archives, I believe we can decode at least some of the entries. She began working through the inventory lists they had discovered, using her reference materials to translate the coded entries. As the true meanings emerged, all 3 of them grew increasingly excited about what they might find behind the sealed door. Here's one entry that translates to personal correspondence of Her late Majesty, preserved in original condition, Dr. Hartwell read. And This one refers to jewelry of particular historical significance, removed for safekeeping during the succession period. There are also references to artwork commissioned privately and never displayed publicly, and documents relating to family matters of utmost discretion. Thomas felt his professional instincts sharpen as he considered the implications of these translations. If the chamber really did contain personal royal correspondence and other sensitive materials, the security considerations would be enormous. Such items would be of incalculable historical value, but they would also represent potential security risks if they contained information that was meant to remain private. Dr. Hartwell, he said carefully, in your professional opinion, what are the chances that these materials have remained undisturbed and in good condition after all these years? And if we do manage to open the chamber, what protocols should we follow to ensure that any contents are properly preserved and protected? The historian considered his question thoughtfully. The conditions in underground stone chambers are actually quite favorable for preservation, particularly if the area has remained sealed and dry. Stone walls provide excellent insulation against temperature fluctuations, and the absence of light would have prevented many forms of deterioration. If the original storage methods were properly designed, there's a reasonable chance that papers and other materials could have survived in remarkably good condition. Mrs. Ashworth had been listening to their conversation with growing amazement. Do you realize what this could mean? She said. If we really have discovered a cache of previously unknown royal treasures and documents, this could be one of the most significant historical finds in recent memory. The scholarly value alone would be extraordinary, not to mention the insight it could provide into royal family history that has never been publicly documented. Thomas found himself caught between excitement and caution. His responsibility was to ensure the security of the estate and its guests, but he was also beginning to understand that they might have stumbled upon something of genuine national historical importance. The proper handling of such a discovery would require careful coordination with various authorities and experts. I think we need to proceed very carefully, he said. First, we should attempt to open the door using the instructions Dr. Hartwell has found. But before we actually enter the chamber or disturb any contents, we should probably notify the appropriate authorities and arrange for proper archaeological and historical support. Dr. Hartwell nodded in agreement. The Royal Collection Trust would certainly need to be informed, and depending on what we find, we might need conservators and other specialists to ensure that any materials are properly handled. However, I do think we should at least open the door and conduct an initial assessment. The excitement of discovery aside, we have a responsibility to determine what we're dealing with before involving other parties. After much discussion, they agreed on a plan of action. They would return to the underground chambers with the proper equipment and attempt to open the door using the instructions Dr. Hartwell had discovered. If they were successful, they would conduct a careful preliminary examination of the contents, document what they found, and then determine the appropriate next steps for involving other authorities. The descent into the underground chambers felt quite different this time, charged with anticipation and purpose. They had brought several powerful lanterns to provide better illumination, as well as cameras to document their discovery and protective gloves to handle any materials they might encounter. Dr. Hartwell had also brought a digital scanner in case they found documents that needed to be copied without risking damage to the originals. When they reached the elaborate oak door, Dr. Hartwell consulted her translated instructions and began examining the complex locking mechanism more closely. According to these documents, the key must be inserted and turned halfway to the right. Then, the center medallion must be rotated 3 full turns counterclockwise, followed by pressing 2 specific points on the surrounding metalwork in sequence. Thomas watched as she carefully followed the instructions, noting the precision required for each step. The mechanism was clearly the work of a master craftsman, designed to be both secure and elegant. As Dr. Hartwell completed the final sequence, they heard a series of soft clicks from within the door, followed by the sound of heavy internal bolts sliding back. The door opened slowly, revealing darkness beyond that seemed to swallow their lantern light. As they stepped forward and raised their lights, the beams revealed a chamber that took their breath away. The room was larger than they had expected, with a vaulted stone ceiling and walls lined with ornate wooden cabinets and glass display cases. Even in the uncertain light, they could see that the chamber contained an extraordinary collection of items that had clearly been carefully arranged and preserved. Mrs. Ashworth was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. My goodness, it's like stepping into a private royal museum. Look at all of this. The chamber was indeed remarkable, clearly designed not just for storage, but as a proper treasury where beautiful and valuable items could be displayed and appreciated. The wooden cabinets were of the finest craftsmanship, with glass fronts that allowed viewing of the contents while protecting them from dust and humidity. Ornate stands held various objects, and the walls were lined with what appeared to be paintings covered with protective cloths. Thomas approached one of the glass display cases and raised his lantern to examine the contents. Inside, he could see an array of jewelry that sparkled even in the limited light. Necklaces, brooches, and rings were carefully arranged on velvet cushions, each piece clearly of extraordinary quality and workmanship. A small placard, written in the same coded style as the inventory lists, presumably identified the specific pieces and their significance. Dr. Hartwell moved to examine the covered paintings on the walls, carefully lifting the edge of one protective cloth to peer underneath. Thomas, Mrs. Ashworth, you need to see this, she said, her voice filled with awe. This appears to be a portrait that I've never seen before, but the style and the royal regalia suggest it could be from the late 18th century. The quality of the work is extraordinary. As they explored the chamber with growing wonder, it became clear that they had indeed discovered a treasure trove of royal artifacts and personal effects that had been carefully preserved for over 2 centuries. The variety of items was remarkable, ranging from jewelry and artwork to what appeared to be personal correspondence and official documents stored in specially designed containers. In one section of the chamber, they found several ornate wooden chests that appeared to contain textiles and clothing. When Thomas carefully opened one of the chests, he discovered layer upon layer of silk and velvet garments, each carefully wrapped in what looked like protective linen. The fabrics appeared to be in remarkably good condition, their colors still vibrant despite their obvious age. These could be court dress from the Georgian period, Dr. Hartwell observed, examining the elaborate embroidery and construction of one of the garments. The level of craftsmanship is extraordinary, and if these are indeed royal garments that have never been publicly documented, they would be of tremendous historical significance for our understanding of royal fashion and court life of that era. Mrs. Ashworth had discovered a section of the chamber devoted to what appeared to be books and manuscripts. The volumes were stored in specially designed cases that had protected them from moisture and pests, and many appeared to be in excellent condition. Some of these look like they might be personal journals or correspondence, she said. The handwriting on the visible pages appears to be quite elegant, and there are several that seem to bear royal seals or monograms. Thomas found himself increasingly amazed by both the scope and the condition of the collection they had discovered. It was clear that whoever had created this treasury had spared no expense in ensuring that the contents would be properly preserved for future generations. The attention to detail in the storage methods and the obvious care taken in organizing and protecting each item spoke to the enormous value placed on these possessions. As they continued their initial exploration, taking photographs and making careful notes about what they had found, Thomas began to consider the enormous responsibility that had suddenly fallen upon them. The historical and monetary value of the collection was clearly immense, but beyond that, these items represented intimate pieces of royal family history that had been entrusted to the safekeeping of this estate for over 2 centuries. I think we need to step back and consider our next moves very carefully, he said as they prepared to conclude their first examination of the chamber. What we've discovered here is clearly of national historical importance, and we have an obligation to ensure that it's handled appropriately. But we also need to respect the fact that many of these items appear to be quite personal in nature, and there may be very good reasons why they were sealed away rather than placed in public collections. Dr. Hartwell nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right, Thomas. This discovery raises as many questions as it answers, and we'll need to proceed with great care and wisdom. But what an extraordinary privilege it is to be the first people to see these treasures in over 200 years. As they secured the chamber and made their way back through the underground passages, Thomas reflected on how completely this discovery had transformed his understanding of his assignment at Rosewood Estate. What had begun as a routine security preparation had become an adventure that would likely change his life and potentially make a significant contribution to British historical knowledge. The implications of what they had found would need to be carefully considered, but for now, Thomas felt a profound sense of satisfaction at having played a role in bringing these long-hidden treasures back to light. The peaceful estate had revealed its most closely guarded secret, and the responsibility of deciding what to do with that knowledge now rested in their hands. The fourth day at Rosewood Estate brought with it an atmosphere of barely contained excitement as Thomas, Mrs. Ashworth, and Dr. Hartwell prepared for a more thorough examination of the extraordinary treasury chamber they had discovered. During the previous evening, they had spent hours discussing the implications of their find and developing a careful plan for documenting and studying the collection without risking damage to any of the precious items. Dr. Hartwell had spent much of the night researching similar historical discoveries and consulting with colleagues about the proper protocols for handling such sensitive materials. She had also managed to decode several more entries from the inventory lists, revealing tantalizing hints about the specific nature of some of the items they had glimpsed in their initial exploration of the chamber. "I've made contact with a conservator I trust completely," Dr. Hartwell explained as they gathered in the library before descending to the chambers. "Sarah Chun from the British Museum has agreed to provide guidance on proper handling techniques, and she's prepared to come here personally if we determine that immediate professional intervention is necessary. However, she's assured me that as long as we follow basic conservation principles, we can safely conduct a preliminary examination without risking damage to the materials." Thomas appreciated the thoroughness of Dr. Hartwell's approach. His security background had taught him the importance of proper preparation and risk assessment, and he felt more comfortable proceeding with their investigation knowing that they had access to expert advice. However, he remained acutely aware of the potential security implications of their discovery. "Have you given any thought to the question of notification?" he asked. "At what point do we need to inform the royal household or other authorities about what we've found? I'm mindful of my responsibilities as a royal guard, but I'm also aware that this discovery could have significant implications that go well beyond the scope of my usual duties." Mrs. Ashworth had been considering the same question. "I think we need to understand more about what we're actually dealing with before we can make informed decisions about who needs to be notified and when. Some of the materials we glimpsed yesterday appeared quite personal in nature, and there may be privacy considerations that we need to take into account." Dr. Hartwell nodded in agreement. "My experience with similar discoveries suggests that we should conduct a thorough but respectful preliminary examination, document everything carefully, and then consult with the appropriate authorities about the best way to proceed. The Royal Collection Trust has established protocols for exactly these types of situations, but they'll need detailed information about the nature and condition of the materials before they can provide proper guidance." As they made their way back to the underground chambers, Thomas found himself reflecting on how dramatically his role had evolved over the past few days. His original assignment had been straightforward security preparation, but he now found himself serving as a guardian of what might prove to be one of the most significant royal treasure discoveries in recent memory. The responsibility was both thrilling and sobering. The chamber appeared even more impressive in the better lighting they had brought with them today. High-quality LED lanterns revealed details that had been hidden in the shadows during their initial exploration, and the true magnificence of the collection became increasingly apparent. Every surface seemed to hold treasures that would have been remarkable individually, but were absolutely breathtaking when viewed as a complete collection. Dr. Hartwell had brought specialized equipment for documenting their findings, including a high-resolution camera designed for archival photography and careful measuring tools for recording the dimensions and condition of various items. She began by creating a systematic photographic record of the chamber itself, capturing both overall views and detailed images of specific sections. "The organization of this collection is remarkable," she observed as she worked. "Whoever created this treasury clearly had extensive knowledge of proper conservation techniques. Look at how the jewelry is displayed to prevent metal contact, and notice how the textiles are stored with acid-free materials to prevent deterioration. This level of care suggests that the collection was intended for long-term preservation rather than simple storage." Thomas found himself drawn to a section of the chamber that contained what appeared to be official documents and correspondence. The papers were stored in specially designed boxes that had protected them from moisture and light, and many appeared to be in excellent condition. As he carefully examined some of the visible documents, he noticed royal seals and letterheads that suggested these were official communications of considerable importance. "Dr. Hartwell," he called softly, "I think you should see this. Some of these documents appear to bear the personal seal of Queen Charlotte, and There are others that look like they might be correspondence with various European royal courts. If these are authentic, they could provide unprecedented insights into the political and personal relationships of the late 18th century royal family. The historian hurried over to examine Thomas's discovery, her excitement evident as she studied the documents through the protective glass of their storage containers. These could be extraordinary historical resources, she breathed. Queen Charlotte's personal correspondence is quite rare, and any previously unknown letters could significantly enhance our understanding of her role in British politics and society during that period. Mrs. Ashworth had been exploring another section of the chamber and had made an equally intriguing discovery. "Come look at this," she called from near a series of ornate display cases. "I believe we have what appears to be a complete collection of coronation regalia, but in miniature. These pieces are exquisitely crafted and appear to be perfect-scale reproductions of the actual crown jewels." Thomas and Dr. Hartwell joined her to examine the remarkable miniature regalia. Each piece was crafted with extraordinary attention to detail, using precious metals and what appeared to be genuine gemstones. The craftsmanship was so fine that the pieces could have served as jewelry in their own right, but their obvious connection to the actual coronation regalia suggested they had been created for a much more specific purpose. "I've read about miniature regalia sets being created as gifts for young members of the royal family," Dr. Hartwell said, studying the pieces carefully. They were sometimes commissioned to help children understand the significance and symbolism of the actual crown jewels, or as special commemorative pieces marking important royal occasions. If this collection dates to the late 18th or early 19th century, it could have been created for the children of King George III. The thought of these beautiful objects being created as gifts for royal children added a deeply personal dimension to their discovery. Thomas found himself imagining young princes and princesses playing with these exquisite miniature crowns and scepters, learning about their future roles and responsibilities through these perfectly crafted toys. As they continued their exploration, they discovered section after section of remarkable items. There were collections of rare books, including what appeared to be first editions of important literary works and scientific treatises. One case contained an array of scientific instruments that looked like they had been crafted by the finest instrument makers of their era. Another held what appeared to be architectural models of various royal buildings, crafted with extraordinary precision and detail. Perhaps most intriguingly, they found a section devoted to artwork that appeared to have been created by members of the royal family themselves. Personal sketches, watercolor paintings, and even what looked like poetry written in elegant handwriting were carefully preserved and displayed. These intimate creative works provided a glimpse into the personal lives and interests of people who were usually only known through their public roles and official portraits. "Thomas, look at this," Mrs. Ashworth called from yet another section of the chamber. "I believe this might be a collection of personal jewelry that belonged to various queens and princesses. The settings and styles span several decades, and some of these pieces are unlike anything I've ever seen in public collections." The jewelry collection was indeed extraordinary, ranging from delicate everyday pieces to elaborate ceremonial ornaments. Each piece was carefully labeled with coded information that Dr. Hartwell was gradually learning to decipher. Some appeared to have belonged to Queen Charlotte herself, while others were marked with initials and dates that suggested they had been owned by various other members of the royal family throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As they worked through the afternoon, carefully documenting and photographing their discoveries, Thomas began to develop a theory about the purpose and origin of this remarkable collection. The items seemed to represent the most personal and intimate possessions of the royal family during a specific historical period, carefully selected and preserved for reasons that were not immediately obvious. "Dr. Hartwell," he said as they paused to review their progress, "do you think it's possible that this collection was created during a time of political uncertainty? Many of the dates we've been able to decipher seem to cluster around the period of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Could these items have been hidden away as a precaution against possible political upheaval in Britain?" The historian considered his suggestion thoughtfully. "That's actually quite a perceptive observation, Thomas. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were indeed times of considerable political uncertainty for European monarchies. The French Revolution had shown how quickly royal families could lose not only their power but their lives, and many British aristocrats and royals would have been acutely aware of the need to protect their most valuable possessions. Mrs. Ashworth looked up from the inventory list she had been studying. That would certainly explain the level of secrecy and the sophisticated security measures we've encountered. If these items were hidden during a time when the royal family felt genuinely threatened, it would make sense that they would go to extraordinary lengths to ensure the treasures remained safe and hidden. As the day wore on, and they continued their careful exploration of the chamber, Thomas found himself developing a deep appreciation for the foresight and planning that had gone into creating this treasury. The person or persons responsible for assembling and preserving this collection had clearly understood that they were safeguarding not just valuable objects, but irreplaceable pieces of British history and culture. The emotional weight of their discovery was beginning to settle upon all three of them. They were not simply examining old objects in a storage room. They were serving as the first witnesses in over 2 centuries to a carefully preserved slice of royal family life. The intimate nature of many of the items made them feel like intruders into private family moments, even though those moments had taken place generations ago. I keep thinking about the person who made the decision to seal this chamber, Mrs. Ashworth said as they prepared to conclude their work for the day. Imagine the weight of responsibility they must have felt, knowing that they were potentially the last person who would see these treasures for an unknown length of time. They couldn't have known that we would discover them now, but they clearly hoped that someday someone would find and appreciate what they had preserved. Dr. Hartwell was carefully packing away her equipment and notes. What strikes me most is the love that went into creating this collection. These weren't just valuable objects thrown together for safekeeping. Someone took enormous care to select items that would tell a story about the people who owned them, and they arranged everything with obvious affection and respect. Thomas found himself moved by the same observation. Throughout his career in royal service, he had sometimes lost sight of the human dimension of the monarchy, focusing so intently on security protocols and official procedures that he forgot about the real people at the center of it all. This collection served as a powerful reminder that behind all the ceremony and formality were individuals with personal loves, fears, hopes, and dreams just like anyone else. As they secured the chamber and made their way back through the underground passages, Thomas reflected on how profoundly this discovery had affected him. His understanding of his role as a guardian of royal traditions had deepened and evolved, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose in his work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they grappled with the question of what to do with their extraordinary find. But tonight he felt privileged to have been chosen to play a role in bringing these long-hidden treasures back to light. The peaceful atmosphere of Rosewood Estate had taken on new layers of meaning and significance, and Thomas knew that his time here would remain one of the most memorable and meaningful experiences of his life. The estate had shared its greatest secret with them, and the responsibility of honoring that trust would guide their decisions in the days to come. The fifth and most extraordinary day at Rosewood Estate began with an unexpected phone call that would change everything Thomas thought he knew about his assignment. Mrs. Ashworth found him in the library early that morning, where he had been reviewing their documentation from the previous day's exploration of the treasury chamber. Her expression was a mixture of excitement and nervousness that immediately captured his attention. "Thomas, I've just received the most remarkable call," she said, settling into the chair across from him with obvious care. It was from the private secretary's office at Buckingham Palace. Apparently, our expected royal visitor has requested to move up the timing of her visit by several days. She'll be arriving tomorrow afternoon, and she's specifically asked to meet with you personally upon her arrival. Thomas felt a familiar surge of professional alertness, but there was something in Mrs. Ashworth's tone that suggested there was more to this development than a simple schedule change. Did they provide any indication of the reason for the change in timing, or why she specifically wants to meet with me? Mrs. Ashworth paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. The message was rather cryptic, but the private secretary mentioned that Her Royal Highness has become aware of certain historical discoveries that have been made at the estate, and she wishes to discuss them personally. "Thomas, I think our guest may already know about what we've found in the underground chambers." The implications of this possibility sent Thomas's mind racing. If their royal visitor was already aware of the treasury chamber and its contents, it would suggest that the discovery was not as accidental as they had assumed. Perhaps there had been records or family knowledge about the hidden treasures that had been passed down through royal channels, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring them back to light. Dr. Hartwell arrived shortly after, having received a similar message requesting her presence during the upcoming royal visit. Her scholarly excitement was even more pronounced than usual, and she could barely contain her theories about what this development might mean. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said, spreading out various documents on the library table. "The timing of everything is too precise to be mere coincidence. Your assignment here, our discovery of the chambers, and now this sudden change in the royal visit schedule. It all suggests that we've been following a plan that was set in motion long before any of us realized it." Thomas had to admit that the same thought had occurred to him. Throughout his career, he had learned that apparent coincidences involving the royal family were often carefully orchestrated events designed to achieve specific purposes while maintaining the appearance of natural occurrence. The possibility that he had been chosen for this assignment precisely because of his character and experience, and that the discovery of the treasury was meant to happen under his watch, was both thrilling and somewhat overwhelming. "If that's true," he said, "then we need to consider the possibility that our royal visitor may have extensive knowledge about the contents of the chamber and specific plans for what should be done with what we've found. Our role may be changing from discoverers to guardians of a process that's been planned for much longer than we realized." Mrs. Ashworth nodded thoughtfully. That would certainly explain the level of care and preparation that went into preserving the collection. If the royal family always intended for these items to be rediscovered at some point, they would have wanted to ensure that everything was maintained in perfect condition for that eventual moment. As they discussed these possibilities, Thomas found himself reviewing everything he had observed about the estate since his arrival. The peaceful atmosphere, the dedicated staff, the careful maintenance of every aspect of the property. All of it could have been part of a long-term plan to create the perfect environment for the treasury's eventual rediscovery and whatever purpose it was meant to serve. Dr. Hartwell had been studying the inventory lists with renewed attention, looking for clues about the specific purpose behind the collection's creation and preservation. "I've been focusing on some of the coded entries that I hadn't fully deciphered before," she said, pointing to several lines on one of the lists. "This entry appears to translate to items preserved for the restoration of family understanding, and this one says treasures maintained for future reconciliation. There seems to be an emotional or relational purpose behind this collection that goes beyond simple preservation of valuable objects. The idea that the treasury might have been created to serve some future purpose related to family relationships or understanding added a deeply personal dimension to their discovery." Thomas began to consider the possibility that they had stumbled upon not just a collection of royal treasures, but a carefully planned legacy intended to heal old wounds or bridge historical gaps in understanding. "Perhaps," he suggested, "the items were selected and preserved because they tell a story that someone wanted to ensure would eventually be told. The personal letters, the family jewelry, the intimate artwork, they all provide insights into the human side of royal history that might have been lost or misunderstood over time." As the morning progressed, they made final preparations for the royal visit while continuing to discuss the implications of their discovery. Thomas found himself approaching his security preparations with a new understanding of their importance. He was not simply protecting a royal visitor. He might be facilitating a moment of profound historical and personal significance that had been centuries in the making. The afternoon brought a flurry of activity as the estate prepared for the arrival of their distinguished guest. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, making final adjustments to ensure that everything was perfect. Thomas positioned himself at the main entrance, his mind focused on his responsibilities while part of his thoughts remained occupied with questions about what the next few hours might reveal. When the royal car finally appeared at the end of the long drive, Thomas felt a familiar combination of professional alertness and personal excitement. As the vehicle approached the main house, he could see through the windows that their visitor appeared calm and composed. But there was something in her bearing that suggested she was as anticipating this meeting as much as he was. As the car came to a stop and Thomas stepped forward to open the door, he found himself looking into eyes that sparkled with warmth and what appeared to be barely contained excitement. The woman who emerged from the car was elegant and gracious, but there was an energy about her that suggested she was here for a purpose that went far beyond a simple social visit. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, extending her hand with a smile that was both formal and genuinely warm. "I cannot tell you how pleased I am to finally meet you. I understand you've had quite an adventure during your time here at Rosewood." Thomas found himself responding to her obvious sincerity and enthusiasm. "Your Royal Highness, it has indeed been an extraordinary assignment. I hope I fulfilled my duties to your satisfaction." though I must confess that the experience has been quite different from what I initially expected." She laughed, a sound that was both musical and completely genuine. "I suspect it has been different for all of us, Mr. Mitchell. But I believe that's exactly as it was meant to be. Shall we go inside? I'm very eager to hear about your discoveries, and I have quite a few things to share with you as well." As they walked through the entrance hall, Thomas noticed that their guest seemed completely at home in the environment, moving through the rooms as if she had been there many times before. Mrs. Ashworth and Dr. Hartwell joined them in the drawing room, where afternoon tea had been prepared with the kind of attention to detail that characterized everything at Rosewood Estate. "Before we discuss what you found in the underground chambers," their visitor said as they settled around the tea table, "I want to share something with you that will help explain why this discovery is so important to me personally. The treasury you've uncovered was created by my ancestor, Queen Charlotte, during a time when she feared that important family history and personal treasures might be lost due to political upheaval." Thomas felt a thrill of validation as their theories about the collection's origins were confirmed, but he also sensed that there was much more to the story than they had yet discovered. Queen Charlotte was a remarkable woman who understood the importance of preserving not just valuable objects, but the stories and relationships they represented, she continued. "The items in that chamber were carefully selected to tell the story of her family during one of the most challenging periods in royal history. But they were also chosen because she hoped they would someday help future generations understand the human side of royal life that often gets lost in official histories." Dr. Hartwell leaned forward with obvious fascination. "Your Royal Highness, does this mean that knowledge of the treasury has been passed down through the royal family all these years?" Their guest smiled and nodded. "In a sense, yes. The story of Queen Charlotte's hidden treasury became part of our family folklore, though the exact location and the means of accessing it were lost for many generations. It wasn't until recently that family papers were discovered that provided the clues needed to locate the chamber and understand its purpose." Thomas was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been orchestrated. "So my assignment here wasn't actually coincidental. You knew that the treasury would likely be discovered during security preparations for your visit. Your assignment here was very carefully planned, Mr. Mitchell," she confirmed. "But not in the way you might think. You were chosen not because we needed someone to discover the chamber, but because we needed someone with exactly your character and experience to serve as its guardian once it was found." Queen Charlotte's instructions were very specific about the type of person who should be entrusted with her treasures. Mrs. Ashworth had been listening with growing amazement. "Are you saying that there were actually instructions about who should be allowed to access the chamber when it was eventually opened?" "Indeed there were," came the reply. "Queen Charlotte was remarkably prescient about many things, including her understanding of what kind of person could be trusted with intimate family history and valuable cultural artifacts. The person she described in her writings sounds remarkably like Mr. Mitchell here, someone with unquestioned loyalty to the crown, extensive experience in protecting what is precious, and, most importantly, the wisdom to understand that some treasures are more valuable for what they reveal about the human heart than for their monetary worth." Thomas found himself deeply moved by this revelation. Throughout his career, he had often felt that his work was appreciated but not necessarily understood. The idea that his personal qualities and character had been recognized and valued at such a profound level was both humbling and inspiring. "What happens now?" he asked. "What was Queen Charlotte's intention for these treasures once they were rediscovered?" Their royal visitor's expression became even warmer and more excited. "That, Mr. Mitchell, is where your adventure truly begins. Queen Charlotte created this treasury not just to preserve the past, but to enrich the future. She wanted these items to be used to tell stories that would help people understand the human reality behind royal life, and to bridge the gap between the institution of monarchy and the people it serves." As the afternoon progressed, and their guest shared more details about Queen Charlotte's vision and plans, Thomas began to understand that his discovery of the treasury was not the end of his extraordinary assignment, but the beginning of a new chapter in his life that would be far more meaningful and rewarding than anything he had previously imagined. The peaceful estate had indeed changed his life forever, but not in ways he could ever have anticipated. He had found not just hidden treasures, but a new purpose that connected him to centuries of royal history and tradition while pointing toward an exciting and fulfilling future. The guard who had entered Camilla's estate just days before had been transformed into something much more significant, a guardian of royal legacy and a bridge between past and future, entrusted with treasures that would enrich understanding and appreciation of royal history for generations to come.